Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. In today's episode with Phil Zuckerman, we talk about his secular studies program and what that encompasses from a philosophical, political, and sociological perspective. We also talk about his book, What It Means to Be Moral. In addition to answering that question, we discuss why a religious foundation is not required to lead a moral and ethical life. I bring you my conversation with Phil Zuckerman. Phil Zuckerman, thank you for taking the time to speak with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
My pleasure. Good to see you, Leslie, and thanks for the work you're doing.
I want to start with your title. You're a professor of secular studies, and when I hear that, I was a little bit confused. I want you to tell me what it is, because to my mind, pretty much everything outside of theology, political science, mathematics, engineering, economics, geology, pretty much every course is fundamentally secular in nature. So what is it that you do as a professor of secular studies?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we can unpack that. Other people prefer other terms, and I can talk about the strengths and weaknesses of that. So basically, it works like this. I'm a social scientist, so I was trained in sociology, and I'm also a professor in the sociology department here at Pitzer College in Southern California. My understanding of the social sciences, whether it's sociology, psychology, and I like to include history in the social sciences, even though they don't include themselves. Um, any of these social sciences, I think the ultimate goal is to understand and study humans, what they do, how they interact, what they think, what they believe, what they eat, you name it. That's our object of study, and that's what differentiates us from people who study stars or plants or whatnot. So if you want to understand people, you can approach that in many ways. You can do that through a variety of lenses, and obviously you're going to have to focus on something. You might focus on race, you might focus on marriage and family, you might focus on educational systems, you might focus on cognition and neurological processes, whatever your focus is. So in academia, one thing that has developed is something called religious studies, which is, an interdisciplinary focus on religion, past, present. So there's psychology of religion, there's anthropology of religion, there's sociology of religion, there's all the disciplines in if you go to a good religious studies department, it might have economists, it might have historians, it might have, and it's treating religion as an object of study the way you would have an Asian American studies department or a Jewish studies department or an Africana studies department. Any department that takes a Scandinavian studies department that takes a certain part of humanity as their subject of study. And that's great, and we should do that. And there definitely should be religious studies. It's a big part of the human experience. And you can't understand humans if you don't understand religious life, religious symbols, religious groups, rituals, beliefs, etc., etc. Okay, now what we have been seeing is an explosion of humans openly declaring that they live lives either indifferent to religion or against religion or somehow without religion in varying degrees. They are not they have a naturalistic worldview as opposed to a supernaturalistic worldview. They find community outside of religious auspices. They raise their children and develop ethics and morality in human ways, not in deference to imagined beings or whatnot. So in other words, we have this growing chunk of humanity, and it is a chunk. It is hundreds of millions of people. In fact, for the first time in history, we have some societies now that are more non-religious than religious. So, for example, a recent study just came out that more people in the UK are not Christian than are Christian. In places like Scotland, you have 70% of the population being non-religious. In Estonia, in Czech Republic, in South Korea, in Japan, in places like Uruguay. In other words, in British Columbia, my goodness, the numbers are staggering, where rates of religious belief, behavior, and belonging are evaporating like you wouldn't believe, and people are living their lives without religion. They're living secular lives, and they are a big chunk of humanity. And we haven't been studying them with the same rigor and vigor as we have studied other chunks of humanity. When you tell people that there's a Jewish studies department on campus, no one bats an eye, even though Jews are less than 0.1% of the global population. If you tell people that you have a Asian American studies program, no one bats an eye. But atheists, agnostics, humanists, or just apatheists, indifferent people, irreligious people make up in some cases 5% of a population, in other places like in the United States 30%, and in other places like Czech Republic up to 70% of the population. And not even going to China and so on and so forth. So secular studies decided to be deliberate and say, we want to study non-religious people, movements, and groups, past and present, to understand the human experience more thoroughly, and not just treat irreligiosity or secularity as some residual category. We need to understand who secular people are, how they vote, how they raise their kids, how they deal with death and life, how they develop morals and ethics, how their existence intersects with nationalistic movements, political movements, the media, etc., etc. So secular studies was created to make non-religious people and groups and movements and ideologies the centerpiece of our analysis.
That's great. And so, can you define secular for me? Because I'm a volunteer for the Center for Inquiry Canada. I'm also the secular chair. But I think that but I think the definition that I'm using for secular is different than the definition that you're using. So for
Yeah.
me, that I'm talking about political secularism.
Oh,
So
yeah.
that is government neutrality in matters
Yeah.
of religion.
Sure.
The basic tenet is that government should be neutral in matters of religion. It should neither support nor suppress religious belief or expression among the
Right.
populace. But I get the sense that you are what you're studying, and when you say that you're a secular chair or a secular professor, it's more of a philosophical secularism. As you put it, the naturalistic versus a supernatural worldview. Is that a reasonable distinction between the two?
So, what this exchange just illustrates is the need for secular studies. And let me explain why. What that term means is different in different contexts. In a Canadian context, the word secular has a certain meaning. In an India context, it has a certain meaning. In a Los Angeles, these meanings are different. And there are different meanings that people attach to secularism. That's what we're trying to study in secular studies. In other words, what it means, no one can agree what it means to be religious. What it means to be religious in Vietnam is different from what it means to be religious in Texas, and that's what religious studies tries to capture. So that's also what we're trying to do here. What does it mean to be secular in British Columbia or Ottawa? What does it mean to be secular in Scotland or Estonia? That's part of the questions, but that's just this kind of meta answer. Now let me specifically answer your question. The kind of secular you're talking about, a political secularism, or what we might call a Jeffersonian secularism from Thomas Jefferson, with that wall of separation between church and state, or a sort of laïcité from a French perspective, is certainly an important star in the constellation of all secularisms. But I would say that yes, when I say secular, when I say a person is secular, I don't mean they have a very clear understanding of how they think government and religion ought to be related to each other. I think most humans that I call secular just don't really have that level of political theory, historical knowledge, governmental insight, et cetera, et cetera. I'm using the term secular to either just to mean non-religious. Someone who lives their life without religion is a secular person. But I'm not saying that you have to use that definition, or that it's some scientifically derived definition that I can prove with an algorithm. It's just in the context, in the circles that I swim. So for example, is it philosophical? Yes, sometimes. Is it political? Yes, sometimes. But it's often neither. It's often a complete indifference to these questions. It's living one's life without a concern or interest for these kinds of questions at all. And that's even really interesting to me. Steve Bruce, a great sociologist, once said that the end stop, the final train station of secularization is not anti-religion, but utter indifference to religion. To get back to your question, I kind of talk about secularism because to me, ism implies ideologicalness, movementness, politicalness, and I think there's three main secularisms. There's a kind of philosophical secularism that has to do with a kind of world, life view about how, nature versus natural processes versus supernatural materialism, naturalism, also a kind of wanting to debunk religion, a kind of sense that religion causes harm rather than good in society. We ought to disabuse our fellow citizens of false religious notions, et cetera, et cetera. I call that a kind of philosophical secularism, and it involves secularism. It involves, again, naturalism, skepticism, et cetera, et cetera. But then I think there's a political secularism, which I think you're talking about, which is the Jacques Berliner Blau, Thomas Jefferson, laïcité version, which it takes no stance on, is there a God or not? It doesn't even care about that. It just simply says we need to keep the relationship between government and religion ought to be, as you said, one of neutrality or not hinging on either one. And that's good for everybody. That's good for religion. That's good for government. That's good for, and that we just don't want religion infringing on our rights, and we don't want government. It's the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. I don't know if there's an equivalent in Canada, but that's the bedrock of U.S. The first sentence of the first amendment to the Constitution, to the Bill of Rights. So that is pretty remarkable. Then the third version of secularism is kind of just a demographic phenomenon. Less people going to church, less people praying, less people believing God, kind of just a cultural demographic phenomena. More liquor stores being open on Sunday, more shopping malls being open on Sunday, fewer people giving two shits about religion at all. And so I see all those three branches of secularity, and sometimes they interconnect, sometimes they don't. But yeah.
Well, I have known about you for about a decade now. I've read a number of your articles. I was involved in a public debate. I think it was about 8-9 years ago on God's role in politics, and one of my arguments, I drew its evidentiary aspect from some of your work, which showed that
Oh, cool.
that the more secular and society is, the more it prospers on just about on just about every measurement that social scientists have. And what I found even more interesting is that this was true not just for nations overall, but for individual states within the United States of America. Uh, can you sort of can you delve into that just a
Yeah,
little bit and explain some of your findings and how you came to that conclusion?
you bet. So something that is constantly trumpeted here in Trumpland, again, it's not something I have spent a lot of time in Denmark. It's not something you ever hear in Denmark. I don't know if you hear about it in New Brunswick, but here in Trumpville, or DeSantis land, or whatever, gun country, or whatever you want to call the United States, a constant refrain by pundits, politicians, forget pastors, that's a given, is that without religion, society will fall apart. That God, without faith in God and fealty to God and prayer to God and obsequiousness to God, if that's even a word, it just popped into my head, or obedience to God, that society will fall apart. Society will have no morality. All will be chaos. All will be degradation and depredation and discord. And I thought, well, that's a sociological claim. You got an independent variable and you got a dependent variable. The independent variable is degree of belief in God or faith in God or worship of God, or church attendance, if you like, or, various indices of religiosity. And the dependent variables are, okay, the state of a given society. It's murder rates, it's poverty rates, it's domestic abuse rates, it's obesity rate, whatever, educational attainment, childcare, whatever measure we use to measure the healthiness of a society. The UN does this all the time. The United Nations has a human development index where it ranks everything from GDP to women's rights to educational attainment to life expectancy, et cetera, et cetera. So I just started to, I'm not a statistician, but it's not that hard to do this. You can find out how religious a society is, either by various common indicators, strength of belief in God in the population, church attendance in the population, whatever you want. And then you can very easily find where state countries rank in terms of educational attainment, women's rights, human rights, civil liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of press. And what I kept finding was the correlation was extremely robust, that the more secular a society was, or we could conversely, the less religious it was, the better it seemed to be on these rankings of societal health and well-being. And then people said, well, you can't really compare countries because there's so much going on, in Denmark that doesn't really apply to what's going on in Brazil. It's just apples and oranges. Fine. And then I looked at the United States, and we have great data, not just by state, but actually even by county. So we have data on strength of belief in God, how often people pray, how often they go to church by county. But I did, you can just stick to the states, that's easier. And yet again, the most religious states in the United States, the ones that have where the largest number of the population has the strongest beliefs in God and goes to church, they have the worst societal problems, whether it's murder, poverty, disease, corruption, you name it, and it goes the other way. So I presented this simply to knock the knees out of my fellow Americans who keep insisting that without religion or faith in God, society will fall apart. If anything, the opposite is the case. Now, I understand correlation is not causation.
So we
And
can't
so it's
say that lack of belief in God makes life better, or conversely, we can't say that being religious will ruin your life.
exactly. And so if anything, if I had to, bet my kids' lives or whatever, I'd say, it's probably the opposite is what's happening. It's probably that as societies tackle certain social ills, they do a better job of addressing poverty. They institute universal health care. They do a better job of public education. They have strong democratic institutions. Then we see the need for religion, the psychological consolation, the communal support, those things go down. So if I had to pick, but fortunately, we don't have to pick. We can see both of these. So in many cases, I think secularity in a society may be a result of strong societies and not the opposite. However, when you really look into it, I see more and more evidence of secularization happening, if not first, certainly as part of that process of a society becoming more democratic and more healthy. I've mentioned Denmark. If you look at Denmark and all the Scandinavian countries, actually, which are sort of the crown jewels of welfare capitalist social democracy, they had strong secularizing forces that were right there building the social democracy. They dethroned, if you will, the religious authorities. They domesticated religion. They were very critical of religion. They pulled religion out of public institutions, and it's no accident that secularism, look at the UK, it's so strong, and Darwin started there. So I do think secular values of here and nowness, rational problem solving, empiricism, acceptance of science, the scientific method, those are part of a secular worldview. Those, I think, have helped create better societies. But I can't say it's, directly like you said, become secular, everything get better, stop being religious and everything be religious, everything gets worse. I wouldn't make that claim, and I don't think the data supports that. And I'll end here by saying, in certain societies that are really fucked up, that don't have good social welfare, that don't have good elder care and good child care and social education, in those societies, actually being religious is an advantage. How else are you going to get food on the table? Who else is going to care for you? How are you going to find child care? So in precarious nations, religion, I think, serves a function. I just think strong policies and institutions do a better job of meeting those needs than relying on handouts from religious.
When you agreed to meet with me, I decided to look you up and do a bit of research to prepare for this conversation. So I got one of your books. It's called
Oh, yay.
What It Means to Be Moral, and it has a subtitle. But you wrote a book with. We'll get to the subtitle in a moment. You wrote a book, and it published 3 years ago, 2019, and it's called What It Means to Be Moral. So I want to. That's a bold title. That's bold.
Yeah.
So I want to give you a chance to summarize, in your view, what it means to be moral, and then we'll get into the content, because I've got a few things I want to talk about from what's in what's in the book itself. But let's start with the title. What does it mean to be moral, Phil?
Well, like anything, it means whatever we say it means. What does it mean to be beautiful? What does it mean to be intelligent? What does it mean? A main point of my book is that moral is an adjective we use to describe people. It is not a scientific term that is proven by a numeric value. It is an adjective. And so, like all adjectives, it only has meaning in context. Beautiful doesn't mean anything unless we have a context. Intelligent really doesn't. Are you intelligent if you can survive, naked in the rainforest for a year, or are you intelligent because you can balance your checkbook, or are you intelligent because you can actually understand Nietzsche, which, by the way, I don't think anybody can, but maybe you can. What is intelligent? So moral is like that. People use the term moral all the time. It's one of the most commonly used words out there whenever discussing religiosity, secularity, politics, crime, et cetera, et cetera. I think so. So, like any adjective, it only has meaning in context. It only has meaning through use, and it only has meaning because we give it meaning. So, for me, based on my understanding of the term, I think it means several things. It means being kind and compassionate and empathetic, helping when help is sought, not harming, treating people the way we want to be treated, increasing fairness and justice in society. Those are the kinds of things I mean when I describe someone as moral. I don't mean they're good at aerobics or that they smell nice. I mean, they treat people nicely and kindly and compassionately. They try to make the world a better place. They treat others the way they would like to be treated. They strive towards making the world more fair and just and so on and so forth. But that's not what you need to mean by it. And so I'm not saying that's the definition. I'm saying that this is how I'm going to use it. And I think we need to start there. So any conversation about morality has to start with, well, what do you mean by moral? Whenever I get into this conversation, people, well, where does morality come from? I have to say, what do you mean by moral? Are you asking where does kindness come from? Are you asking where does obedience to a God come from? So I guess to me, it was for sure a provocative title, especially someone who doesn't have a degree in philosophy. Holy shit. And yeah.
So that's interesting because something you left off of your list that I almost always hear from others is a sense of honesty or truthfulness
Hmm,
or integrity. I
yes.
mean, there,
Yeah.
and that was, you didn't mention that in your list, and that's fine. That's why I ask for definitions, because we do
Yeah.
use words and different people use words. All words have multiple definitions. Several words have very distinct definitions. I want to have
Yeah.
that clarity before we proceed.
Yeah. I like integrity. I'm not so sure I would include honesty. I think a Nazi could be very honest about his opinions and his deeds and what he plans to do with this family of Jews and how he did it. Just because he's honest about it, I wouldn't call him moral. So to me, I like integrity. But yeah, I agree with you. In everyday terms, we would never call a deceptive person a moral
Okay,
person for
so let's
sure.
get on. Let's move on to the subtitle. So it's the title
Okay.
is what it means to be moral, and then the subtitle is why religion is not necessary for leading an ethical life. And like you, I have encountered that argument many times in my interactions with many people that God provides a framework that without belief in the Almighty, then there's nothing to stop me or you from murdering, raping, pillaging, plundering, all manner of evil, vile, nasty things, which
Mm-hmm.
uh, the only reason that I don't do it and the only reason that you don't do it is belief in God, is the way the argument goes. Whether it's the desire for the reward, a fear of punishment, or simply acknowledging the truth about the universe, that God exists and that we should strive to live in the way that the universe is made, and therefore we have to act in the way that God tells us we should. This is not an argument that you accept, to put it mildly. I've read your book, and uh, I'd like to give you the chance to now defend your subtitle. Why isn't religion necessary in at least some respect to lead a moral life of helping and not hurting and striving for fairness and justice. Because just about every religion in the
Right.
world is all about, if you listen to the proponents, it's about helping and generosity and kindness and fairness and justice and such.
So I'm not so sure I agree with the latter. I don't think Islam and Christianity, the two largest religions in the world, are about kindness and fairness and justice. I think they're predicated on extremely evil premises with an evil worldview that entails tremendous unjust suffering. That aside, I actually felt like the subtitle was too tame. I actually think an honest and serious religious belief is inimical to morality. It's actually harmful to moral living. But you're right. The way you characterize and set it up, you're absolutely right. That is how it is framed, and so on and so forth. So, what I would say is, oh man, so many. Let me just start here, I guess. Number one, no moral system that is based on magical thinking of an invisible deity is is worth its weight in four-leaf clovers. I mean, let's just start there. Like, there is no evidence that a magical, invisible deity exists. So already the premise itself lacks any evidentiary support.
I know you've got a long list, and and
Yeah,
I do want to give you the chance, but I want to stop you there and say, even if we grant that, the argument goes that even if that's not true, even if there isn't a god, a deity, that it's a
yeah,
useful fiction, because if people believe in that deity, uh, they they won't they won't do all these awful things, murder, rape, violence of
right.
various sorts, and it's only the belief in God that stops them. So it doesn't matter whether God exists or not, whether the belief is valid. The belief is socially useful, and so
Well,
can you address
yeah,
that and then go back to your longer
yeah,
list?
yeah. So what a terrifying situation we find ourselves in. I'm in a room full of rapists and murderers who want to slit my throat and rape me, but the only thing that keeps them from doing that is not their empathy, not their compassion. So, for example, if I go to YouTube and I Google Rwandan genocide and I see people getting hacked to death with machetes, I'm physically ill by that image. I'm physically sick by that. I believe there are bioevolutionary reasons we don't like to see suffering. I believe there are psychological, sociological, and neurological processes that make us good people, most of us, most of the time, not all of us, all the time. So if the only thing that's keeping you or my neighbor, then we're living in a state of serious precariousness, number one. Number two, that belief doesn't hinder people from raping and murdering. God believers do that constantly. So there's no empirical, if you want to rape and murder, your belief in God is not going to stop you. And if that's the only thing keeping you, then you're not empathetic, you're not compassionate, you're a vicious, psychotic, amoral beast. And I just don't believe that the only thing keeping you from smashing a child's face is, oh, God may punish me for that. And if that's the case, we're all fucked. So what I would say is, I don't believe in useful fictions. I don't believe that useful fictions, let's just tell a lie or pretend something is true because it has useful benefits. To me, that's a house of cards. That is a real house of cards. But the reality is, we have evidence for where our morality comes from. So we don't, and also the evidence shows that when societies lose their faith in God, I mean, if that premise was correct, if the only thing that keeps me from killing you and raping you is faith in God, then why are all the societies that don't have this faith in God just awash in murder and rape? Like, there's just no evidence for this claim. Japan has never had a Judeo-Christian foundation, and they have among the lowest murder rates on planet Earth. Even if they're just Buddhist, which does not have this notion of a heaven and hell. But I'm getting lost here, so let me see how I can step back a little bit. If the only reason my neighbor isn't going to kill me is because they believe in a magical invisible being, great. I guess I'm still not going to sleep well at night, because to me that's a very paper thin, problematic reason to act morally or to not act immorally. I don't, and the fact that all the world's religions preach these things makes perfect sense, because all the world's religions were created by humans. They are all the product of human culture. And humanity and human culture, we know the sources of our goodness. And I can walk us through those. So it makes perfect sense that those evolutionary traits, those psychological traits, those traits that are there way before religions were ever invented, find expression in religious stories, in religious writings, and religious imaginings, because they're part of who we are.
Okay. So it was really I was asking you to say why religion is not necessary for living an ethical life.
Oh, yeah, you bet. So, you got it. The only things we need to live a moral and ethical life are things like compassion, empathy, and a desire to not see suffering and alleviate if we can. That's, to me, the wellspring of all moral systems, all moral intuitions, all moral. So when I'm driving on the freeway at night and a person, for whatever reason, they're drunk, they're stoned, or they're crazy, or they're suffering from mental illness, starts walking across the freeway, and my wife shrieks, "Stop, don't run into that person." She's not doing that because she has read the extensive writings of Kierkegaard or Kant. She has a visceral desire not to see another living thing destroyed. We have natural desires, and we have so much evidence for this. So let me walk us through it. First of all, our closest primate relatives, bonobos and chimps, are social mammals who, whilst occasionally violent, generally get along and cooperate and have a desire and comfort each other, and that they don't believe in Jesus or Muhammad. We have lots of research on infants less than 1 year old who, even before they're verbal, express a altruistic tendency. They don't like wickedness. They like niceness. This is seen through, you can show them puppet shows of a puppet being awful or a puppet being sweet, and they will gravitate towards the sweet puppet and hate the awful puppet. We have evidence of babies before they can even walk or talk wanting to help a parent who's struggling with groceries and drops their keys. I mean, we have so much evidence of babies already expressing these things. So where does our morality come from? Number one, our bioevolutionary past. We evolved as primates in groups of 20 to 80 for millions of years. And in those groups, we had to develop the ability to cooperate in order to survive. We had to develop a theory of mind, an ability to understand what another person is thinking or feeling in order to communicate and survive. So we developed traits of cooperation and in-group favoritism. We also developed some nasty traits of out-group hostility, which we can get to, but we developed and evolved over millions of years, just like other mammals and social animals, the tendency to care about each other, and take care of each other. It's not absolute. I would say, 70% of the time, 70% of us are being good, and 30% of the time, 30% are being awful. And we have genocides in it, but the general tendency is to cooperate, want to get along, and be sickened by suffering. Then we are all cared for from 0 to 2 by another human being, or we don't live. So we all have that experience of being cared for by another human, usually our mother, 99% of the time, sometimes an aunt, a grandmother, or a father, or whatnot. But that primes us towards being relational. It develops a sense of there's others out there who can care for us, and that develops an understanding of what it means to be cared for and what it means to be relieved of suffering and misery and uncomfortableness. Number three, we are raised by people around us, and simply by living among other humans, our families, our neighbors, our tribe, our friend, we observe and internalize the norms and values of our culture, which usually lean towards honesty, fairness, justice, care, cooperation, and occasionally they lean towards shitty stuff like homophobia or racism, and that's part of it. And then as we grow, we have a mind and we can reflect. We have our brain understands what it means, what it feels like to be lied to, what it feels like to have friends, what it feels like to be loved, to love. And so we have experiences which allow us to reflect on our actions and the consequences of our actions. So to me, there is a solid bedrock of moral sources that are evidenced through social psychology, psychological research, sociological studies, et cetera. So we don't need faith in magical. Most of us, again, some of us who grew up in violent homes, who were unloved and unwanted, perhaps feeling like God is there watching us, that does give us that that ability to live well. And I wouldn't take that away from a person, but it's not true. There is no magical invisible parent out there who loves us, who's making a list, checking it twice, going to find out who's naughty and nice. And I think we can either live in a state of perpetual childhood where we think there's a magical parent, or we can grow up. And I think growing up is painful, it's brutal, and it's also the only way we can experience freedom, agency, responsibility, and so on and so forth. So I'm kind of going all off here, but I don't know if I'm just kind of throwing spaghetti on the
No,
wall.
that's great. One of the arguments that you make in your book is that belief in God is essentially outsourcing your morality to an external figure, and
Absolutely.
that's bad. That itself is immoral, and I've actually said in the past that.
Absolutely.
I view that as an abhorrent abdication of one's personal responsibility. But this can be
Exactly.
done. This almost outsourcing of morality can be done in a secular way as well. And you use the example in your book of Sergeant Rex, and it's that type of questioning of the morality of an order just isn't compatible with a military force. The Allies probably would not have been able to win World War II if everybody, if they didn't have the discipline of just following the orders without considering necessarily the morality of it. And the Allies did a whole bunch of things that we would consider to be quite abhorrent, like the firebombing of Dresden, and just essentially
Mm-hmm.
flattening the city, or the two
Or
nuclear
yeah,
bombs dropped on Japan. But we also, not just in the military, we demand, at least in Canada, and I think in some instances in the States, that doctors put aside whatever moral qualms they might have about saving the life of a drug dealer or of a gang member. We demand that pharmacists ignore their reservations about the birth control pill. There was a fairly high profile case in the United States a few years ago of a city clerk who wouldn't grant a marriage license to a same sex couple because it violated her personal morality. And so, why is why is the like Hobbesian Leviathan of the state a better determinant of what is moral and what is not than the inerrant commandment of God?
well, the latter doesn't exist, so you might as well ask, then the magical wishes of a unicorn who taps his horn and sends out commands. So that's number one. Number two, I agree that humans have tremendous potential for evil, and when that evil is in power, we are fucked, and genocide results. So it depends what kind of state we're talking about. Is it a democratically elected state, or is it a despot? Is it a dictatorship, a communist dictatorship, a fascist dictatorship? If it's the latter, we're fucked, and fealty to that beast is not a good thing. If you have a democratically elected government, that is going to get us closer to a authority that, government by consent of the government, governed, authority is bestowed, not commanded, then I think we're in a better place. But even then, no one has to, it's what Sartre called bad faith. Like, even the doctor who doesn't want to prescribe birth control pills, if that violates their moral compass, they can say no. They just have to face the consequences. But that's what Martin Luther King did. He said, I'm going to do this. Well, you're going to go to prison. Fine. I mean, that's what it means to be a moral person. When David Harris was drafted to Vietnam, he said, I'm not going. And they sent him to prison. Like, no one wants to go to prison, but ultimately at the end of the day, we are free moral individuals. So we have to make those choices. If a doctor doesn't want to save a patient, they can say no. They may lose their license, but to me, that is exercising one's moral muscle, and that's what makes a person heroic in my mind. I'm not saying we all have that kind of heroism. Many of us would say, fuck it, I don't want to lose my job. Sure, I'll fire that person if you tell me to. Fuck it, I don't want to lose my license. I'll do this even though I have moral qualms. But we aspire to an individual answering to their own conscience. And I think so obedience, whether it's to a teacher, a parent, an umpire, a sergeant, or an invisible God, is always an abdication of one's inner moral voice. I just don't know what else to say. So yes, you're right. Secularly, we do it all the time. We abdicate our moral responsibility and follow the rules. That's a common human trait. But what religion says is there is no opportunity for that. In other words, when God says to Abraham, kill your son, the only response is okay from a God-based moral system. In fact, if God said kill everybody's son, the only answer is yes, sir. It's God. And that's what religion teaches, that you don't know, God knows. And I find that morally abhorrent. So to me, the difference is, at least in a secular context, a person can exercise that authority, and yes, they'll suffer, they'll go to prison, or they'll lose their license or whatnot. But in a religious-based system, punishments are even worse. You're going to hell
Yeah,
forever.
there's a quotation from your book, if you don't mind me reading to you for a moment.
Oh man, music to my
But
ears.
I just think that this one really spoke to me. So I want to read your words, and it says, a major problem with any ethical system based on God. Staunch theists claim that morality is based on belief in God and in following God's will, and yet they can't agree on just what God's will is. Interpretation of God's will becomes the name of the game, and what a deeply problematic, all too human game it is, with everyone interpreting differently. And I just thought, I mean, that's just great. I mean,
Thank you.
you've mentioned three religions over the course of our conversation: Christianity and Islam, and which are the two largest, and Judaism, which is a tiny minority in the world. And each one of these religions has a sacred day of rest, the Sabbath. But the Muslims think it's Friday, the Jews think it's Saturday, and the Christians, most Christians, not the Seventh Day Adventists, but the Christians believe that it's Sunday, and it makes it difficult to know just what God's will is.
Yeah, it's impossible. I mean, and I kind of have this 4-step thing where I say, okay, this is why religious morality can't work. Number one, I've already said there's no evidence that God exists. But even if we said there was proof, even if there was just the most abundant empirical proof that there is a God, whatever that proof may be, and we all observe it and we see it, that still doesn't resolve the problem, because now we're in the situation of interpretation. In other words, we can't no one seems to agree what this God wants or wills, whether it's the day of rest, what kind of marriage structure we ought to have, whether cloning's okay, what to eat, what not to eat, eating animals, not even on any moral question, even murder. They can't seem to. Is murder just? Well, it depends on who you ask, So there's no more. Beating kids, does God want us to do that or not? What masturbate, does God want us to do that? I think there's nothing. So, but even if that were resolved, so even if we had evidence that this magical being existed, we all got the same golden text on our phone every day saying, here's a list of do's and don'ts in every language, and it was just that still reduces morality to robotic obedience. There's no room for conscience. There's no room for reflection. It's just aye, aye, sir. Aye, aye, sir. So we're just walking around like automatons. There goes morality. There goes moral reasoning. Consequences don't matter. Suffering doesn't matter. We just aye, aye, sir, whatever you said. And even if we accepted that, the fourth, which is the Euthyphro dilemma, which goes back to the Socratic dialogue, what makes that moral? Well, because God said so. Why does God say so? Is it moral because God said it, or does God say it because it's moral? And either one of those is problematic. So in the first half of my book, I try to deconstruct God-based morality. And in the second half of the book, I try to talk about, well, where does secular or non-God-based morality come from, and what are its components and attributes? But I just don't get it, man. And the more I think about it, I'm just like, what planet are we living in? I do agree that religion has its benefits. I see that here in the United States, the land of AK-47s and AR-15s. Like, sure, people get a lot of benefits from religious community, religious worship, religious faith. I get it. But just because that's the case, I still ultimately don't think it's healthy for humanity moving forward. I could be wrong.
My favorite quotation goes back to Epicurus, and the trilemma: is God
Yeah,
willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence
yeah.
cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God?
Exactly. I mean, just the basics of it. I can't tell you how many Americans I run into, people, friends, oh, I'm sending my kid to Catholic school because I wanted them to get some morality. And I'm like, what more? Wait, you think it's moral to teach children that there's a magical, invisible God who cursed all of humanity because they defied him, and there's a devil running around, and there's a heaven and a hell, and if you don't do this, you will go to hell? How is that moral? It's a little bit. I don't know. Sometimes I think I'm kind of nuts because I just live in a world where I'm like, it must be me. Like, it must be me. And again, that's not to say that the Catholic Church doesn't do some good things, but they do those things despite their faith, not because of
Yeah,
it.
and there's
I think.
certainly no shortage of evils perpetrated by that particular institution. But when it comes to kids and morality, I mean, morality is a very uh, amorphous, very challenging, a very deep concept, and it and really engaging with that. Like even as an adult, that can be challenging, and that's the nature of some of the most intense conversations and debates and good faith
Absolutely.
arguments that I've had with friends and family, and I can see why that would be. A challenge to engage with children, but then so might religion certainly not the heaven and hell. I'll agree with you wholeheartedly there. That's sort of a poor basis for foundation. But when you're looking at the breadth of human relations, you can almost be paralyzed by the potential for, like, if you've got no grounding, no framework, no starting point, not a foundation, and you're trying to start from scratch, it can be overwhelming, and you don't know where to start, and particularly as a kid. So without that foundation to make decisions, might not religion be useful, at least as a starting ground on which to build?
Yes and no. I would say depends which kind of religion. If it's a very progressive, non fundamentalist, highly secularized congregation, like a Unitarian Universalists who sing songs about the morning dew and the blades of grass, and if the Sunday school is about making artwork and talking about how to be a good person, sure. But if it's a different kind of religion, I'm not so sure it's such a strong moral foundation. I think it can breed xenophobia, racism, sexism, homophobia, self-hatred, self-doubt, et cetera, et cetera. But beyond that, I would say I'm a firm believer that a moral foundation in children is derived from lived experience and not didactic teaching. In other words, if children live in loving environments, fair environments, patient environments, healthy environments, where they are experiencing kind and loving and empathic interactions and kind and loving people, 99% of them will grow up to be moral humans. If children are living in violent homes, unhappy homes, precarious existence, with a lot of instability, insecurity, anger, violence, they are going to be much more morally challenged as they grow up. I think they'll still ultimately prevail, but they're going to have a harder time their moral compass is going to be a bit more damaged. And all the teachings and all that's, do this, don't do that. I think that's epiphenomenal. I think it's what we live in the first 10 years of our lives or 15 years of our lives that really shape us. How we see our parents respond to others, how we see friends and children at school responding to each other. I think those are the basis of most moralities and moral systems. And I don't think it comes now. That said, I would strongly bet that if you do want something to as a basis, read Charlotte's Web to your children at night. that story is going to do more than the story of Adam and Eve or the Noah's flood. What the fuck is a kid supposed to get hearing about Noah's Ark? How the fuck does this story make any child a moral person? If anything, it makes them scared and worried and so on and so forth. I don't know what Bible story people are referring to. How does the story of Adam and Eve provide a moral foundation? To me, it's a horrible tale. How does the story of Isaac and Abraham, like what moral story? Maybe we can get to the New Testament and we can have some teachings from Jesus who says, take care of the poor and the sick and don't be violent. Sure, I love all that stuff. But I think that I've read some good Buddhist stories actually that I think have a bit more of a, but you can find stories, and if that's your approach in the secular world, movies, TV shows, and books that illustrate, even read Where the Wild Things Are. That has a much more moral core. The Where the Wild Things Are simply shows that if you run wild and rampant, you're not going to really thrive and you're not going to feel loved. And actually, boundaries and responsibilities is actually what children need, and they want to be told, no, you can't act like a beast or you're going to go to your room. That is actually good parenting rather than let's stay up all night dancing in the woods screaming and yelling. So I don't know, to me, again, I don't want to be an a-hole. Like, I went to went to Jewish congregations. I went to Hebrew school. I loved it. I loved making latkes and playing frisbee with my yarmulke, and I had a crush on Joanna Edelstein, and I couldn't wait to see her. I had a bar mitzvah. I loved learning about Jewish heritage and giving a speech in front of family and friends. I think, I went to an Episcopalian summer camp. I enjoyed sitting on the grass singing If I Had a Hammer and then playing, water balloon fights. Like, I think there's so much good in raising your children in religion if it's a progressive, ethical, religious community. But if it's a fundamentalist, fanatical,
I want to
religious
read
community, I think you're doing
a
damage.
paragraph that was. I can't imagine what it would have been like to write it, because the passion in it just jumped off the page, for me.
Okay.
And the people that you're talking about are the Americans who claim to nurture the closest relationship to God. These are most of the people who fight against structural relief for those in poverty, who fight against equality between men and women, who fight against fairness for gays and lesbians and transgender people, who fight against providing a haven to refugee families fleeing violence, who fight against paid family leave and subsidized health care for the poor, who fight against ending cruelty to animals, who fight against efforts to keep our planet healthy, who fight against stem cell research, who fight against effective sex education, who fight against accurate scientific school curricula, who fight against rehabilitative endeavors in our prisons, who undermine Native Americans' ability to protect the little bit of land they have left, who are the quickest to downplay or ignore racial injustice and disparage movements such as Black Lives Matter, who fight for the proliferation of semi-automatic weapons, for governmental use of torture, for increased use of the death penalty, and ongoing militarism at home and abroad. I just thought, wow, what what a list. And when I recovered from the awe, I thought, no, that's probably a straw man argument. And then I thought about it, and I realized that it was a very high correlation based on everything that I've seen and everything that I've read. Uh, what went into that? Like, I can only imagine what that must have been like to compose that paragraph.
Oh man, thanks, Leslie. I have all the data for every single one of those claims. You pick any one of those claims, and what you will find, and again, I don't know what it's like in Canada, but here in the United States, the stronger your belief in God, the more frequently you attend church, the more frequently you pray, the more likely you are to, you name it, support the proliferation of AR-15s, support the governmental use of torture, be against universal health. Like the claims you just said, I have the data for every single one of those items. It is bizarre. It is living, my understanding of Christianity is it's a nonviolent religion based on love and mercy. At least every time I read the New Testament, I see those, there's other things in there too, but that seems to be the heart of the message. So isn't it a paradox that at least in the United States, the people that claim to most love Jesus, that most love the Bible, that most love God are the ones, as you just read, taking those positions? It's not a straw man argument. I've got the data. I had a pastor from a local charismatic church come to speak to my class last week, and we asked him, "What's going on here?" And we presented that, and he just was like, "I don't get it either. I don't understand it either. I don't know what's going on." So it is a strange time. It is a strange time to live, but I don't know. I wonder if it's always been this way. I wonder if it's always been that the most fervent have, Frederick Douglass, in his autobiography, said the worst slave masters, the more Christian they were, the more I knew I was going to suffer. They beat me the hardest. They whipped me the worst. So again, that's just an anecdote. But no, any one of those items you just read, we've got the data, and I put it on Twitter.
Martin Luther
I
King
write
made a
articles
similar
about it. Like, it's
observation in his
all
letter
there.
from a Birmingham jail, that just how deeply disappointed he was in the leaders of the churches of the United States. So you brought up an interesting contradiction or distinction here, and I want to explore that just a little bit, and then I think we'll probably have to, unfortunately, end the conversation. Whenever I listen to or read the arguments of creationists or climate change deniers or anti-vaxxers, they all use the rhetoric of "I'm telling the truth. The real science says that we are creationists." Like they use the rhetoric of science, integrity, and truth telling
Yeah.
as they say that vaccines kill people, or that God created it, or the world, or that the climate is fine, trivial changes or sunspots or whatever. And so, might it be the case that the foundations of religious morality is good, despite the politicians and church leaders who distort and cynically exploit religious faith to support their repressive, immoral policies and desires?
Yes. So I agree with you about the latter. I think leaders in business, politics, government, whatever, military will often, not always, often use what you just said to manipulate, push an immoral agenda or whatnot. As for the religions themselves being mostly good, I would agree with that because I think religions are a product of human psyche and human culture and human cognition and human experience. So to me, most humans, most of the time, are good, want to live loving lives, experience justice and fairness and peace and cooperation. And those aspirations that stem from bioevolutionary processes, cognition, psychology, et cetera, get articulated in the religions that humans construct. But there's also a vicious and nasty part of us too that is selfish, that is cruel, that is envious and jealous, and those those made their way into our religions as well. There was a great thinker back in the 1800s from Germany named Ludwig Feuerbach, and he wrote a book called The Essence of Christianity, and he said theology is anthropology. Theology, and what he meant was theology is ostensibly the study of God. What theology really is, the study of humanity as in anthropology. Like anything people say about God is a projection of really their own hearts and minds. Anything, oh, God is like this, they're really just trying to work out what it means to be human. And that's why God is sometimes just and sometimes angry, and sometimes he wants us to, it's just like a superimposed, we project what's in our own hearts into what we think about God. Humans have tell stories. We're storytelling humans, and those stories get codified in religious doctrines and religious scriptures, and most of those stories are good, and some of them are nasty and vicious and brutal. So I think in general, most of what religions say and try to do is probably good because they come from the human experience, not the other way around. I just think that it's not that we are good because we have these religious stories. It's rather that those religious stories exist because that goodness is in our hearts. through natural processes.
I think that everyone should read the Bible. Like in Western societies, you need a literacy of at least the stories of the Bible just to be culturally literate. But that we should read the Bible the way we read Shakespeare,
Sure.
not because Shakespeare is all
Absolutely.
knowledgeable and all good, but there's a lot of really good ideas in there, as well as warnings. And the Bible should be read with the same mindset that
Exactly.
and there's some stuff that needs to be discarded that was a reflection of the time, and we've learned and progressed since then.
Exactly. Absolutely. 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 I'm glad you mentioned Shakespeare. This is my challenge. I challenge anyone to read the entire Bible, even though no one can agree on what books comprise the Bible. You know, Protestants and Catholics have a different Bible, Jews and Christians have a different Bible, but whatever. Pick a Bible, read it all the way through, spend a year studying it, and then read the complete works of William Shakespeare. I promise you, you will find the complete works of Shakespeare much more entertaining and much more moral. The life lessons, the warnings, the expressions of what it means to be alive, what it means to struggle, what it means to have human relations, what it means to have guilt, what it means to have jealousy, what it means to experience love is going to be much more clearly articulated and better articulated than any fucking thing you're going to find in that Bible, which, I just have to throw that out there.
That which is good in any religious text is a reflection of our basic moral nature, not absolute moral nature, but our basic moral nature. Then we can just sort of cut out the middleman or the middle text and just study and work
Exactly.
with our basic
Exactly.
human nature, which is mostly good, and learn ways to emphasize that and mitigate those negative elements. And I guess and that's what you're trying to do as a professor of secular studies.
Exactly. Well, I'm trying to.
As a
Secular studies
secular,
is a
I'm sorry,
different
yes, as a
ballgame. I think
secular
that's more what I'm
activist,
trying
you're
to do
using
as
your
an
secular
activist, as a
studies to
secular.
understand
Yeah,
the means by which you can be a
exactly.
successful secular activist. Well, then, okay. Well, Phil,
Perhaps.
I want to thank you for your research.
Yeah.
I have found it useful in my activism here in Canada. I want you to
Oh,
continue.
thanks.
Please continue researching. Please continue
Thanks.
writing. Please continue to be an activist. Your vision and mine, I think, are largely compatible, and it's been a great pleasure
Thanks so
to
much,
speak with you.
Leslie.
Just two two more quick questions.
I appreciate that.
Any last thoughts on anything that we've discussed today?
I think I come off. I think this in this hour I've come off of maybe a little too strong, a little too harsh on religion, and I don't think that serves us. I think people get defensive quickly. I think maybe I'm experiencing a little polarization myself here in the U.S. It's just been such a rough 5 or 6 years with Trump, so I need to learn to maybe turn the temperature down a bit, out of respect towards others, and also maybe to accomplish more. So I just want to throw that out there. And the other thing is just I just want to thank you. Writing books like this is a solitary endeavor. You sit alone, you work alone, you think alone, maybe you talk to a colleague, but you crank out a book and then off it goes. So it means a lot to me that you read it, that certain passages resonated for you. That means a ton, and I'm so glad to connect. And I guess my question for you is, I often my wife is we're about to get her Canadian citizenship secured. Her father was born in Canada, so she's eligible. And I just want to know, like, I always look at Canada as the kind of, hope of North America. Like there is hope just beyond the hinterlands. But every now and then I read about, like, you got your own anti-vaxxer, movements. You've got your own evangelical movements there. And I'm very curious to see if Canada will sort of go a different direction than the US is and sort of double down on its democracy, double down on its secular values, its humanism, or will will the blood of the US kind of spill into the Canada and you'll get the same kind of gun-loving, Bible-thumping paranoia that dominates here?
Neither path is inevitable. There is no question that we here in Canada are
Yeah,
significantly influenced by trends in the United States, and for many things, what's dominant in the United States has a lag of about 5 years and then becomes quite prominent here in Canada. One of our former prime ministers referred to Canada and the Canada-U.S. relations as sleeping next to an elephant. But but it's not inevitable, and both paths that you just mentioned are possible in my view, and so that's why it's one of the reasons why I volunteer for and work at the Center for Inquiry Canada, and it's one of the reasons why we started this podcast so that we can
Awesome.
we can delve into complex topics and discuss them with intelligence, with nuance, and in a sense lead by example of not everything, really nothing should be reduced to a soundbite, but we don't have time for everything. But with the investment of an hour or so for each episode, you can. The goal is for people to gain an understanding of a topic, and it's to avoid. It's to create. It's to create the happy scenario of a evidence-based policy, and where we don't know what's going to happen, using reason and logic based on knowledge, that animates my activism and what I've been doing for when I'm not parenting and not working for the last 15, 20 years or so. So whatever. So what path are we going to take? I don't know, but we're working for the rosier scenario, and hopefully we will take a
I
very
love it.
different path than what we've seen in the U.S. for the last 5 or so years. My last quick question for you: what's next for you? You've written books, you've got articles. What's your next big project?
So two things. I'm very much involved. Three things. I'm very much involved in a new media hub website called OnlySky, which is a new. It's a website of news, culture, politics, art. From a kind of intrinsically secular perspective. It's not all about secularism or atheism, but it takes that perspective for granted. And so I write a lot for OnlySky. I edit for OnlySky. I encourage your members to check us out every day. We got new items
I'll
on
link
our
to
OnlySky,
onlysky.media
onlysky.media.
in the
That's
feed
a
notes,
biggie.
so the listeners can.
Thank you. Thank you. And then I've got a new book on secularization, actually, a more academic book. It's not an activist book that's coming out on NYU Press in March. So that's just kind of charting the data around the loss of religiosity all over the world. And number 3, I work with Humanist Global Charity. I'm an executive director for Humanist Global Charity, which is a wonderful organization that does a lot of good in the world. So if you're interested in sort of donating $5 now and then to a humanist organization that helps people in need all over the world, check us out. So those are my 3 endeavors right now.
And if people want to find you online, you want to plug
Um,
any websites or social
I
media?
was doing Twitter. Now that Elon Musk is, at the helm, I keep deactivating my account. So I'm sort of struggling there because it's such a useful tool to post things on and so on and so forth. But Elon Musk is going down the drain of Trumpism, and I just can't stand it. So I am on Facebook. I haven't yet ventured into Instagram or TikTok. I'm not there yet. But yeah, the best thing is follow me on OnlySky, because I'm publishing articles all the time there, so you would get updates whenever I publish something new on OnlySky. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, Phil Zuckerman, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me on Podcast for Inquiry. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and engage in the conversation. Comment, rate, and review. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Center for Inquiry Canada. We rely entirely on donations to be your voice supporting science, free inquiry, critical thinking, and secularism here in Canada. To our supporters, thank you. If you have not yet contributed, please consider making a donation at centerforinquiry.ca/donate, or becoming a member for only $30 per year at centerforinquiry.ca/join. Your support will help make it possible for us to continue making our collective demand for reason and evidence-based decision-making everywhere. CFIC is on the web at centerforinquiry.ca. Find us on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Matt Payne, Nikolay Nikitushkin, and Martin Zelinsky. Music by Anthony Lazaro. See you next time.